Susan Shifflett, who's Programme Associate at the Wilson Centre's China Environment Forum. Susan, so good to talk to you. Let's start by talking about the specific Heinz story. Where exactly does this contamination problem come from?
Sure. So it's still not clear. There's currently an internal investigation going on, at least from what we can tell from Chinese news sources, which have cited a Heinz spokesman who apparently said that the contamination of lead was introduced into the soybean ingredient, which was one of the raw materials for the high-protein baby cereal, probably during a time when components were being exchanged for routine machinery maintenance. So that's what we think we know right now. It appears that the incident has been isolated to one supplier, so we don't think it's more widespread, but as I mentioned before, the investigation is still ongoing.
Susan, why China? Why do these food scares seem to be happening so often in China these days?
Yeah, so I think that we have to kind of take it into context, thinking about before China opened, before the 1980s, people were pretty much producing their own food, and so the producer and the consumer to a certain extent were the same, but now there's been, with urbanization, there's a huge distance between the production of food and consumers in the city. So there's less accountability, there's more distance across the supply chain. So I think there's two major factors right now. One is the environmental, so a fifth of China's farmland is polluted. Some studies have said that 10% of Chinese rice is laced with cadmium, which is a heavy metal from industrial runoff. In this case with Heinz, I think is more the second category, which is a supply chain issue. Part of the issue is China's kind of in what I described like the Wild West right now. Almost 80% of China's processors have less than 10 people. So if you imagine, it's like the size of maybe an American baseball team. So there's just a lot of changes going on. There's not a lot of regulation that's being able to keep pace in terms of implementation with all of these changes.
Now, as I mentioned, the Chinese government is publishing this list of dairy producers that are allowed to produce dairy products for China. I mean, there is evidence, isn't there, apart from just that the Chinese government is taking steps towards trying to improve the situation?
Absolutely. So I think public pressure has been mounting. I think what you're seeing is, one, in addition to the list, in 2009, following the milk scandal in 2008 that you mentioned, the Chinese government enacted the 2009 food safety law, which was the strictest food safety law to date. And they recently just solicited comments, and they're slated to add amendments that will make the law even more stringent and give the regulatory oversights even greater control and more power to add more accountability. So I think they're doing that. But you also have to consider both the corporations. So for instance, Walmart was found last year, I believe, selling fox meat labeled as donkey meat. And so they've committed tripling their food safety spending by 3 times to about 48 million US dollars by the end of 2015. And then lastly, a group that we don't always think about, but the individual citizens. So one of the really interesting stories is there's a 28-year-old entrepreneur named Wu Heng who started a sort of crowdsourcing website where people can upload across the country various food safety concerns or food scandals that they've come across.
Okay.
So I think that across the board you're seeing a lot of pressure.
Okay, Susan Shifflett, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us here on the Business Edition.